when we went from the medieval warm period, which was warmer than now, by the way, into the Little Ice Age, there was a series of crop failures, which led to famine, which led to pestilence. And then you had I think in about the 1340s, you had the bubonic plague, and that pretty much spelled the death knell for this tremendous enterprise. But if you look at what was built in that little period, you had over 80 of these great monuments on the scale of Notre Dame, Reims, Amiens, Chartres, Lyon, these amazing buildings, these amazing structures. And then you had about 500 lesser abbeys that were being built at the same time. And then they all kind of started within a decade or two of each other and all seemed to taper off and end within a decade or two of each other. Now, at the same time this is happening in Europe, we have the final wave of great building in the southwestern deserts of the US, out there in the Chacoan culture. We have the final wave of the great monumental earthwork structure in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, right? Is this a coincidence that for whatever reason, people in North America, Central America, Europe, Indonesia were suddenly seized with this inspiration to go to work and build these incredible structures, all using a very similar system. And now, even though if you look at, a monumental earthwork of North America, it's very obviously distinct from a Gothic cathedral. Nobody's going to mistake one for the other yet. The geometry and the proportions and the numbers that show up over and over again, they're the same. They're the same. For example, I can show you numerous great truncated earthwork pyramids that are 1,056 feet on a side. I don't know if you remember that number, but that came right directly from our dimensions of Stonehenge. Here's one of the great scholars of architecture. We find ourselves in the midst of technical advances without parallel in Egyptian history. Now, this is going back to this wave right here, 3rd millennium BC. The new problems of using stone as a building material were solved with astonishing quickness within a single century. So this is in a place now where you've basically for many centuries, if not millennium, the assumptions are that it was subsistence farmers. And then all of a sudden, they've got this tremendous engineering skill, astronomical knowledge, geological knowledge. Where did it come from? What's the source and origin of this? Dimensions of the stone blocks grew ever larger, from the small 25-centimeter ashlars of Zoser's complex to the large limestone blocks of the Giza pyramids, and up to the megalithic boulders of 18 to 30 tons that compose the so-called Temple of the Sphinx near Kefren's Valley Temple. And André Perrot, in his Sumer, The Dawn of Art, says this: now that we can view the Mesopotamian basin in all its splendor, it is becoming clear that this flame, which blazed up so suddenly in the Middle East and shed so wide a light, was kindled at several points, each with its own nuance and distinctive luster. Susa, Lagash, Ur, Uruk, Ashnanak, Assur, Nineveh, Mari, all alike were centers whose civilization advanced from strength to strength until at last, thanks to the genius of the few and the boldness of many, there was wrought forth, as in an alchemist's crucible, a prodigious many-sided art. I find that the thing I've underlined, the genius of the few. Well, then, see, that raises the question in my mind of, well, who were the few? What was the source of their knowledge, if they were real? How are they able to inspire a whole society of people? Like if you think about the Gothic, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that ultimately had to be organized. They have to be fed, clothed, housed. For every person working, you had to have at least a half a dozen people supporting that. You had stone quarries, amazing thousands upon thousands upon thousands of stones being quarried, right? They had to be transported. They were then shaped and carved to be into the cathedral. Then you had the sculptural programs, these amazing sculptures. You had the glazing programs, the stained glass windows that still have properties that no one has been able to quite figure out, how they're refracting light so that it almost appears as if the light is emanating not through the glass, but from within the glass. The carpenters that could build the scaffolding and the formwork had to be extremely knowledgeable. And then it's laid out according to astronomical considerations. So the scientific expertise, the engineering expertise, the skill and the craftsmanship is mind-boggling. And if you haven't been to Europe and toured cathedrals, highly, highly recommend it. So I'm going to skip a few things here because I want to get, we don't have a lot of time. This is a wonderful book by Louis Charpentier, The Mysteries of Chartres Cathedral. If we confine ourselves to Gothic art, this alone puts a question to which no answer has ever been given. We know all about Romanesque origins. We follow the path from monument to monument, period to period, but the Gothic has always eluded attempts to fix its origin. The historic question remains posed. It appears suddenly, without preamble, towards 1130. In a few years, it reaches its apogee, born whole and entire without experiment or miscarriage. And the extraordinary thing is that all at once, it has at its disposal master craftsmen, artisans, builders, enough of them to undertake the construction of 80 huge monuments in less than 100 years. But how do we explain that the labor force was so easily found and so soon put to work? One does not have to be a member of the craft to realize that the building of the cathedral at Chartres was not the work of apprentices, and that all concerned, carpenters, stonecutters, and masons, were masters in their art. However, between 1194 and 1220, churches and cathedrals were being built throughout France, churches and cathedrals that were not the work of apprentices. In Normandy alone, not far away, they were built in the 12th century, 15 great churches, of which 8 were abbeys. In the 13th, 13, of which 5 were abbeys. For the whole of France, we must reckon that between 1150 and 1250, 150 monuments were put in hand, among them churches of the dimensions of those in Paris, Reims, Amiens, Sens, and Rouen. How was it possible to assemble qualified labor so quickly? And that's a question that remains unanswered. Something had to motivate and inspire these people. They weren't slaves, obviously, we know that. I mean, the scholars, oh, well, it was Egyptian slaves built the pyramids. I have serious reservations about that conclusion. We certainly know that in France, it wasn't slaves, it was people. Something motivated these people. Something inspired them. But what could it have been? And again, the question, how was it all organized so quickly and by whom? Something was going on off the stage of history that has been lost and forgotten. And I think it's up to us to try to understand what it was. And see, it's like the cycle comes around periodically, that the need goes out for some great undertaking, some great work to commence. I mean, that's kind of what the great work is. And I have felt, since I was a young man, that we are living in such a time now. So what I'm interested in is the trigger. What is it that's going to motivate us to unify as a society and undertake a great work? Because when we look at France during the High Middle Ages, we are seeing a phenomenon that required the entire society to be oriented around this work. I mean, if I think of modern examples, maybe the closest I can come to is, my memory of the Apollo program and the moon mission in the 60s. That's the closest I can come to. But there's something else at work here, and it's an authentic mystery. And I'm of the mind that if we understood what that trigger was, we could reactivate the process in our own time. But I don't think we're going to be building cathedrals. What would this kind of work, what kind of form would it take? What kind of incarnation would it take in our own time? This is the thing I want you to be thinking about. And how can this knowledge that is at our disposal now be unified and brought to bear to understand? And this is where we get into the whole idea of education and why we need to completely revolution and revamp our educational system. And we have modern technologies, but we also have access to ancient traditions, hallowed traditions, proven traditions. And what we've got now is basically a factory system that dumbs people down, makes them incapable of thinking critically, thinking independently, basically just doing what they're told. Don't ask questions. Trust the experts. How many of you watched Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse series? Good. Okay. Now, maybe there's 50 or 60, 70 of you that were watching this, watched it, and how many of you watching that would come away independently with the conclusion that, oh, Graham Hancock is a racist and a white supremacist? Did anybody in here get that from that Ancient Apocalypse show? Yet every critic I read, every attack on him, and there had to have been at least 8 or 10 of them that I read, they all were saying the same exact thing, even to the point of using some of the same terminology. So what's going on there? And why are the experts so afraid of us reconsidering our own history? Stephen just said, because a paradigm shift means they're out of business, and that's a big part of it right there. But they are really, see, there was a time a decade or two ago when, people like myself and Graham and Ed and Robert Schock and others who were doing this kind of stuff thought, well, we're safely out on the fringe. Nobody's going to put a target on us because we're talking about ancient engineers or any of that kind of stuff. But here we are now in 2022, 2023, and people proposing alternate interpretations of our own history are being targeted. Now, not literally, I don't think anybody's going to attempt to assassinate Graham, but what they're trying to do is assassinate his character. Why? Well, as I've read through some of the things, and I've actually composed and written a whole response to the critics, which is going to be online soon. A couple of things jumped to the forefront. One was this. Graham Hancock is promoting dangerous conspiracy theories. That was said over and over again, right? And Flint Dibble, one of the experts, who said, I'm a real archaeologist. Who are you going to believe, Graham Hancock or me, right? He was one. There were several others. They said very similar things like this. In conclusion, well, why should we be concerned? One journalist is talking to, I think it was one of the archaeologists who led this attack. Well, why should we be concerned about, this? Isn't it just some harmless fringe? Well, no, because if you believe Graham Hancock over the experts, well, you might believe that doctors would lie. You might believe that politicians would lie. They even said this, you might believe that 9/11 was a conspiracy. One of them even said that. Now, what it told me as I'm reading that, and I'm getting into dangerous territory here, is that the whole construction of reality that we've been spoon-fed for a couple of generations now is a house of cards. And the fact that they would be scared of somebody like Graham Hancock, who's the kind, gentle British gentleman, asking questions and proposing alternate interpretation of history, the fact that they should find it so important to galvanize and put out these talking points, and that's another question. Obviously, if they're all, nobody in here read or watched that series and concluded that Graham Hancock's a white supremacist. But are you telling me all of these archaeologists and journalists and stuff independently concluded that? No way. They're all reading from the same talking points or from the same script. So then the question becomes, who's writing this script?